Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Fluin, and I am a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. Throughout my career, I've been entranced by the power of tools. The right tools, used in the right way, have the power to improve our lives as developers, but also to increase the quality of our work. Part of the reason I joined Google was to help developers find and adopt great tools from across the ecosystem. Over the past day or so, we've heard a lot about progressive web applications. Part of what we've heard has been some of the great case studies about the outcomes that we get from adopting these technologies. And we've also heard about some of the ways that these improve the user experience. I want to peel back the onion a little bit now of PWAs and get into a little bit of the tooling, the ways that we build progressive web applications, and the way that tools can help us do that. I'm going to go through this in basically 4 parts. First, I'm going to start off with an introduction to kind of the state of progressive web apps as they are today. Then we're going to go ahead and dive into some of the goals of the tools. Why do we build these things? What are the philosophies behind these tools? Then we'll talk about single-page applications and the libraries and frameworks that exist today to use these things. Then we'll end with some best practices that you can take back with you as you start adopting some of these tools and as you look at adding progressive web applications to your workflow. So let's start by looking at the state of PWA tooling as it is right now in September of 2017. We're all chasing after the perfect progressive web application, but a lot of us come from very different journeys. Some of us already have large applications. Some of us have greenfield projects where we can experiment and try new things. But when we talk about the perfect progressive web app, I like to think that we're talking about 3 things. We're talking about building applications that are fast, reliable, and engaging. And when we combine this with thinking about the tooling that exists for us as developers, we're really looking at how do we get the best developer experience for providing our users the best experience, the best DX for the best UX. So what can tooling do to help us with all of these different problems? Well, when we talk about our users, their time is very, very important. As we've heard many times throughout the conference, even seconds or milliseconds of time that you make your users wait for your application or for pieces of functionality can cost your business money. It can lose you conversions every time. We also talk about bandwidth. In many cases and in many user environments, the amount of bandwidth that your application takes is a direct decision factor in terms of whether or not they're going to use your product or service. Additionally, tools can do some very interesting things. By giving a tool an understanding of the browsers that you're looking to target, and by combining that with an understanding of what tool or browser the user is using to access your application, we can send down just the right code at the right time. Additionally, push notifications are a really great way of building engagement with PWAs, and tooling can help us understand these things a little bit better. As developers, a lot of the time we're writing code and maintaining code. And so using PWAs to generate code for us, or using tools to generate code for PWAs, can be a huge impact for our lives. And lastly, tools really focus on allowing us to take advantage of best practices by giving us a deep understanding, using tools like Lighthouse that expose from across the industry the best practices that have been collected by the Chrome team. Some of the technology behind PWAs include the web app manifest, which we'll talk a little bit about, the service worker, which I'll talk a lot about, but a lot of this is going to come down to you building great applications. Tools can only do so much to help you advance and take advantage of the latest and greatest capabilities of the browser, but you still need to be thinking about your use cases. You still need to be worrying about your users. So let's talk a little bit about the web application manifest. The web app manifest is really designed to try and let both browsers and the web at large know about your application. We're really trying to elevate the code that we write from a single page that's going to be served at a single time, or a set of JavaScript and HTML, into the concept of a collective application that we know something about. It has themes, it's got icons, it's got a starting place. We can tell the browser, the device, how it should be accessing our site and how we should be presenting it to the user. Some tools can do things like default generation. They can give us a manifest that we can then easily configure. Other tools will actually guide you through the entire process of making decisions. Service workers are the underlying API in browsers that give us these kind of modern superpowers for building progressive web applications. By adding a service worker to my app, I can do a lot of very cool things. I can proxy and intercept all of the HTTP requests that my application makes. By doing that, I can decide when and where I want to be serving from the internet, from a local cache, or maybe even some generated content that I'm storing within my service worker. But service workers have a relatively complex lifecycle, and as we think about things like caching, each of these things can be done at any of these stages, whether it's when the user first visits the page and we're still rendering from their HTML, after the service worker has been installed and we're given a chance to actually go and cache these things, or even later, maybe when a user is visiting a page for the second time or the third time. We can make decisions at each of these points of the life cycle, but tools can help us make those decisions. So let's talk about one specific case, which is file caching. As a developer, we can decide, hey, I want to cache all of the assets from my application, maybe as part of the installation process, because it's so important to my app. Or maybe I see caching as a nice-to-have for my application, and I want to install after the application has installed my service worker. This can be helpful by taking some of the work that's being done by the browser out of the critical path for rendering, giving users a great experience. We can also do things like runtime caching, because we don't always know all of the data our application is going to need when we write it. A lot of data is coming from servers and backends, and as the user accesses them, we can decide, hey, I'd like to cache these things so that if my user does go offline, they're able to access all of the content that they've previously seen. Finally, there's also advanced caching strategies, because by combining our knowledge of our applications with our tool's knowledge of the user, we can actually do far more advanced things that really drive great user experiences. Another technology that we really want our tools to help us with is push notifications. Because as developers, there's a lot of work here that can be done if we want to take advantage of it. And there's best practices that the browsers are leaning towards. One of these best practices is that we want different behaviors for push notifications, whether we're using the application actively on the device or whether the service worker is being woken up behind the scenes when the user is not interacting with our device. When the user is not interacting with our device, we actually want to show a notification. But there's some additional things we can do if the user is live and engaging with your application. These sorts of best practices can be baked in via tooling. Another thing that I care a lot about is code generation, where we want to give you the code that's going to help you get your work done faster. Good tools that do good code generation are going to be fast by default. They're going to be great by default. And they can even do things like help you with your build pipeline. So help you write code and ship that great code to your users with all of the sorts of metrics and things that you need to understand how your users are going to consume your applications. I see code generation as a very interesting idea because it combines this ability to give a developer a great experience by default without eliminating any of their flexibility or control of what they actually ship to users. So when we talk about PWAs, there's a few different ways that Sam talked about yesterday in terms of building them and adding them to our existing workflow. He talked about maybe I'm going to write a new app from scratch taking advantage of PWAs. Maybe I'm going to rewrite one feature of my application and take advantage of PWAs fully. Or maybe I want to look at it a little bit differently and add one PWA feature to my entire application. Things are a little bit simpler when we talk about both the generic tools and the framework and library-specific tools, because typically, as a developer, I'm targeting that library or framework for my entire application. And because of this, it's much easier for us to take the best of PWA and apply it holistically to my application all at one time. But it's still possible to take advantage of some of these tools and build a fully custom service worker or PWA implementation that follows my business needs and the needs of my users. One of the really fantastic tools is Chrome and the developer tools that we've been building into them. I'm going to come back to this a couple times because the application tab in the developer tools is one of your best assets for understanding what's going on when it comes to building a PWA. It's there that you can bypass the service worker for network calls so that you make sure you're getting the most fresh data. You can understand the lifecycle. Is there a service worker that's pending install? Is there one that's already been installed? What's the state of my cache? Can I look and see what has been cached and what its status is? But Chrome developer tools are also very awesome because we've baked in some of these awesome tools for finding best practices, such as Lighthouse. So now, using Lighthouse, I can figure out, am I building a great progressive web application? Is my application doing well on performance? Can I broaden my audience by taking advantage of more accessibility best practices? And overall, what are the practices that we've discovered from across the ecosystem that I could be taking advantage of in my app? So we have a few generic tools. So these are tools that could be used for any web application that exists today. And one of the best for doing this is called Workbox. So this is a project from the Chrome team that takes the best of what we've got in terms of our understanding of the use cases and the needs of developers and packages that in a very easy-to-use library. Workbox is fantastic in the way that it embeds offline caching, even newer things like offline analytics, and new APIs that are now coming available in browsers, such as background sync. Background sync is a very important concept because it allows us to not only get the freshest data when a user is interacting with our application, but we can do some of that behind the scenes so that the moment our user accesses our application, even in an offline mode, we can still give them the freshest data that they expect. I love Webpack. There's a lot of different tools out there for building applications with Webpack that have PWA attributes. One of these is Offline Plugin for Webpack. Offline Plugin really focuses on the file caching aspect of service workers and PWAs. With Offline Plugin, you can do ahead-of-time caching, so give me all my files up front. I can do deferred caching, hey, let's go and get these files later. Or I can make some of my files optional and base these sorts of decisions on user behavior in order to cache the files at the right times in the right way. Another fantastic project that you should look at as you're getting to know PWAs is actually from Pinterest. It's on their GitHub, Pinterest/service workers. This is a collection of utilities for creating, testing, and experimenting with service workers. Not only do they have code generation tools that give you a service worker under the hood that helps you move faster as a developer, but they've also done something very interesting. They've built out a mock environment generator that allows you to do testing of your service workers. And this has historically been a little bit of a problem because of the newness of these APIs and the way that sometimes the browser is actually ignoring the back end of your application entirely. And so mocking out these sorts of environments and testing them can be very important for ensuring that we have fantastic user experiences. Another tool that you should be aware of that you're going to see all over the place is a set of tools called sw-precache and sw-toolbox. This was another set of tools from the Chrome team that were utilities for building service workers. These tools had the same goals and values as Workbox, but they were a little bit less modular, flexible, and extensible. And so the team decided, hey, we want to collect this array of tools that we've built, we want to reflect on the best practices that we've learned over the past few years, and we want to bake those into the new tools. So sw-precache and sw-toolbox have, for the most part, been replaced by Workbox if you're building a generic implementation of a PWA today. But what you'll see is that sw-precache is still used by many CLIs today, and it's still a fantastic tool for building PWAs. Another tool to have in your toolkit is Hacker News PWA, or hnpwa.com. This is a website where we're collecting the best practices across a number of different tools, libraries, and frameworks for building progressive web applications. For each submission, we track both the speed as well as some of the capabilities of it. There's tools from projects like React, Firebase, and Angular. There's more than 20 implementations of this Hacker News client, and they really tried the best to show off the capabilities of the framework and of their PWA capabilities in a way that's open source and that you can take advantage of and learn from as a developer. So now let's get into a little bit about the goals and the philosophy behind these tools. I like to think that technology tools are really about simplifying the mental model in a good way. It's very easy to do this wrong, because what we're doing under the hood is we're finding new abstractions for concepts that have existed before in lower levels, but we as developers can't hold all of the complexity in our heads at one time. We have to focus on smaller subsets of the projects and the tasks that we're trying to accomplish. And tools are fantastic at taking an abstraction and saying, here is the thing that I can help you with. Additionally, tools can help you with different edge cases. And finally, tools can help you save time. Let's dig into these a little bit more. So when we simplify mental models, this is something that we often have to do. One of the common programming jokes is that there's two unsolved problems in computer science: naming things and cache invalidation. Caching is a very, very hard topic. And so if we focus via tools more on use cases than underlying implementation, the tools can actually help us with that a huge degree. The service worker lifecycle I also find to be a little bit difficult. And so again, focusing on use cases, the tools can help us with that. The last thing is an interesting conversation that I often have with developers, which is, does web development feel like what I'm used to? Right? We're always mapping new concepts into concepts that came previously for us as developers. I know that I talk to developers that are in some ways stuck in the web development that we did 5 or 6 years ago because they haven't been able to take advantage of the newer capabilities that we have and the new APIs that exist in the browser. And so good tooling should both be teaching you these mental models and kind of guiding you into the new world while still empowering you to be effective from day one. There's also a lot of edge cases that end up coming up that you might not expect when you start using progressive web apps or service workers. So a lot of us have talked about intermittent connectivity and offline use cases. So one of the things that can happen very easily is, what if your app loses connectivity during the service worker install? A naive implementation that you might do yourself might fail out and say, hey, I can't use any of these assets. Let's uninstall, let's throw away everything we've got, and then try again on the next load. But you could also do something different. Some of the tools will allow you to, for example, keep some of the cached files via some sort of validation. They're using some sort of checksum to ensure that they've got the files and they understand the integrity of those files. We've talked about a lot of offline use cases, but there's also online use cases. What if your user has full connectivity? One of the patterns that's been emerging that I believe is a little bit of an anti-pattern is this little box at the bottom of the page that says, the application is updated, click to refresh. And so this is something that we didn't used to have on the web because applications were always fresh when you loaded them. But now, in the modern web, because we have these new capabilities, we've introduced a little bit of a problem where if I update my application every day, perhaps via some sort of continuous integration system, I don't want my user to be constantly assaulted with this click to refresh, just so that they're getting the freshest content of my app. We also build applications now in much larger environments. Many times, you may be building a front end of an application, but you have no control over the back end of an application. And so as you're looking at adopting things like Service Worker, you may want to be caching files, but maybe the cache headers that are coming back from your API aren't what you expect or aren't what you need to build out the front end. So you can look at things like tools to say, hey, maybe I need to override the cache headers or I need to ignore them, and I need to supply a completely different policy that supports my front end in a way that my back end can't. And then finally, we talk about saving time. As developers, we write a lot of code, but we also have projects that have a lot of DevOps, right? It's not just as easy as writing code anymore. I have to figure out, how am I going to minify this? How am I going to build this? How am I going to combine this with all of the work that other developers are doing? And then how do we ship that down to the user? And all of these things have lots of effort. And so finding the right abstractions and the right tools at each of these stages is very important. So now let's get into the world of single-page applications. So libraries, frameworks, and platforms, oh my. So I'm going to go through these 5 specific tools. I apologize to anyone that's not on this list. There are more tools than I can count and more frameworks than I can go over in the limited time we have. But each of these share a number of things. So each of these tools use some sort of CLI in order to empower developers to be more effective more quickly. So let's go into each of these. So in the React world, we have Create React App, which is a fantastic CLI. If you're using this CLI, what you're going to see is that it creates a service worker and a web app manifest by default. They have a cache-first strategy under the hood to ensure that you get the the fastest experience possible. So for all these examples, I'm going to use Yarn. You as a developer could use NPM or any other package management tool that you want to go fetch from the NPM repositories. But installing Create React App is Yarn global add, so you globally install Create React App. Then I'm going to run Create React App and give it a project name. Then I'm going to cd into that folder, and I'm going to run a build command. What this will get me is a basic kind of hello world, welcome to React application that is awesome in terms of demonstrating how do we get started very quickly, and then giving developers the freedom and flexibility to get into their application and start adding functionality right away. And one thing that is very beautiful to see is that the moment you see that application in your web browser, a service worker has been installed and loaded. So it is a PWA out of the box in a very fantastic way. Let's now talk a little bit about the Preact project and the Preact CLI. This is a CLI that goes a little bit further in terms of helping developers take advantage of the modern web. It has the standard app creation, but it will also do things like generate an app shell for your index.html file. Because it has knowledge of some of your application, it can ensure that that is pre-rendered as HTML, and then you ship that down to the browser to increase perceived performance, which is a very important metric. The Preact CLI is also browser-aware, so if you tell it which browsers you want to be targeting, it can automatically add the appropriate prefixes for your application. One of the things that's fantastic about the Preact CLI is that they've pre-configured your application if you run the appropriate commands for Firebase's server push. So combining, again, its knowledge of your application with its knowledge of the best practices across the web in terms of which files should be pushed down to the browser and which should be waited for or requested only when it's needed by the user, and then baking that into the Firebase hosting configuration. All of the Preact CLI is using sw-precache under the hood today. So just like we saw before, I'm going to add the Preact CLI via the terminal, and then I'm going to run Preact create and give it a project name. And again, I'll just cd into the folder and run the build. And here, out of the box, we're going to get a beautiful material-designed styled app, Hello World. And one of the cool things about this application is it actually includes routing by default, so that you can see one of these very common patterns and get started more quickly. Next, I want to talk a little bit about Polymer and the Polymer CLI. Polymer does things a little bit differently. So while they have the manifest generation and the optional service worker, they actually do a set of distributions for you. And this is something that's unique to how they've built their CLI. So when you run a build, you won't just get a single set of JavaScript that you ship down to the browser. They actually give you 3 options. So they're going to give you an ES5 bundled version of your application, which is the standard version that will work in basically any browser. But you also get an ES6 version or an ES 2015 version that is a little bit smaller, a little bit more performant if the browsers have optimized for ES 2015, which most of them have. But then you also get an unbundled version of that same code. And the idea here is that they're really trying to help you take advantage of the latest and greatest from the browsers and kind of leaving behind some of the legacy that we had to support with ES5 in the past. One nice thing as well about the Polymer CLI is that they have purple by default. So they really believe in this idea of building great user experiences. With the CLI for Polymer, I'm going to install Polymer-CLI. I'm going to make a new directory and cd into it, and then I'm going to run Polymer init. And then what it's going to give me is a set of choices of which starter kit I want to use. So there's several options. The one here that includes PWA out of the box is called Polymer 2 Starter Kit. And then as soon as I've set up that project, I can run Polymer build. Again, I'm going to get an application with routing and some material design styling that out of the box gets me started much quicker. And as we always like to see, it's a service worker out of the box. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about Vue. So there's 2 projects at play here. There's the Vue CLI, as well as the Vue.js templates for PWA. Again, this handles app creation. It handles manifest and service worker and app shell generation. And one of the very nice things about the Vue CLI is that it intelligently loads the bits of your application as they're needed. So it can understand, for example, if you have lazy loaded routes, which chunks based on a user request we need to load right away, and which ones can be asynchronous and deferred for a little bit later. Using the Vue CLI is relatively straightforward. I'm going to install the CLI, and then I'm going to run Vue init, and I'm going to choose the PWA template, and then I'm going to give it a project name. The Vue CLI is fantastic in terms of the way that it gives you a guided setup. And so it's going to be asking you questions about your application and how you want to be serving your users in order to, as you're going, teach you the different decisions that you have to make as a developer. Then I'm going to install the dependencies, and I'm going to run another build command. And out of the box, we have this very helpful tutorial that says, hey, here's some links that will get you started as a Vue developer. And again, we have the beautiful service worker. Lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Angular CLI. The Angular CLI handles app creation. It also handles service worker generation. One thing that's a little bit different about the Angular CLI is instead of using JavaScript to configure your service worker, it has a declarative JSON-based configuration file called NGSW. Another thing that's interesting about the Angular implementation and support for service workers is that they've wrapped push notifications as a service that you can inject into your application in order to do things like registering for push notifications or to observe or listen to an observable that gives you the push notifications that comes from your application, or understanding the lifecycle events that are coming from a service worker. To use PWAs with Angular, you're going to install the @angular/CLI project. I'm going to use the ng-new command with my project name. And then I'm going to flip a flag in the CLI's configuration saying, I would like a service worker, please. And then when you run a production build, you're going to automatically get service worker included in your application that's going to cache all of the static files that are generated as part of the webpack build process. And then you can further configure those via that declarative file saying, hey, these are the files I'd like to dynamically cache, these are the files you can ignore, and so on. When you generate a project like this, it's going to give you, again, a short hello world page that has all of the necessary links to get you further started as an Angular developer. And again, we have the service worker. The Angular team has decided to ship basically a single service worker that is entirely reliant on that configuration file. So obviously, this file exists on disk. It's generated for you, but you can modify it to your heart's content. But it really is focused on exposing all of the capabilities of service worker via that file so you can do configuration easily. There's a few other projects that I want to mention very briefly in the remaining time we have. There's a website called pwa.rocks. There's a PWA builder that you can find online. The nice thing about the PWA builder is that it's a web-based interface for generating a manifest. You'll be able to upload images, and it will generate all the right sizes for you. It'll generate the JSON for you. It'll ask you questions that help you understand what's going into the web app manifest. And then it will ask you, how do you want to generate a service worker? It'll ask you, based on the use case that you're using. For example, are you just trying to cache all the static assets so that the application works offline? Or would you like something more dynamic, where we just cache the assets the application actually uses, so that as a user has interacted with our application, anything that they've touched before can be accessed offline? And then also, within the Angular project, there's a set of tools called ng-PWA tools that let you take advantage of things like server-side rendering. Lastly, let's dive into best practices for building and debugging these things. Remember to check the Applications tab. I've heard stories of developers restarting their browsers, uninstalling Chrome, reformatting their machines because they can't understand why their application isn't refreshing. So service workers are a very powerful API, but because of the way that they can favor performance over freshness, it can actually break some of our expectations around the save and refresh cycle. There's a fantastic guide on debugging service workers by Rob Dodson. The link is bit.ly/debuggingsw. Another recommendation that I would make in terms of best practices is make sure that you're following the tools. Tools are useful because they provide abstractions. But if those are the wrong abstractions, you can end up spending more time fighting the tools because you're going against their intention. So whenever you adopt a new tool, try and understand what the tool is trying to do for you. Try and understand the pieces of the workflow that it's trying to automate. Because you're going to have a much better time if you're using tools the way they intend, so that as they continue to evolve, they don't continually break you. While the Chrome developer tools are fantastic, I would highly recommend that you don't rely on them as the only way that you debug and build your applications. Throttling is one of the really cool features where I can say, hey, give me an emulated 3G connection, or give me an offline connection. But these tools are sometimes not enough and won't reproduce all of the scenarios that users run into on a day-to-day basis when they're on the bus or they're on a plane, for example. It's also important to note that as of today, I believe this is still true, the offline checkbox does not actually affect WebSockets. And so if you're building an application with Firebase, for example, where you're pulling down data via those WebSockets, hitting the offline button will not allow you to test your service worker with that data, because all the data will actually come back when you might expect it not to. One of the other really cool techniques that's just kind of being developed right now is the idea of having end-to-end tests for your service worker. So it's possible and important to think about how do we test and how do we understand the state of our service worker as we're building these applications. So there's two projects I definitely recommend you check out. The first is that Pinterest project that I talked about, where they are mocking out the environments so you can do things in more of a hermetic way. But there's also work being done to build out, for example, a PWA harness, where we can use our standard end-to-end tools, where we're doing browser instrumentation using the debugging mode, and we're actually using UX elements on the screen to check and verify and change the service worker status in the way that the user could be doing. The last recommendation I'd have is really make sure that you're staying up to date. Service workers are a fantastic API that are on millions and possibly, I think that's actually billions of devices today. but it's continuing to expand and evolve as the web ecosystem always does. A great example of this is that we've now seen work being done in Safari to support service workers. And so what that support looks like, we don't actually know, but it's important to understand and use the latest and greatest tools so that you're reaching as many people as you can and empowering as many users with fantastic experiences. So I'd ask you, really just give these tools a try and let us know what your experiences are with them, because we all want to make the web a better place. Thank you so much.